Hello, and welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. We're your hosts, Tori
and Holland.
Two best friends as different as a lion and a mouse. Today we're reviewing Chicago 17 by the band Chicago, and we'll be ranking it on an objective scale of 0 to 10 with only 2 points allotted for personal taste. Feel free to agree, disagree, or learn about something new. And cut to the intro. All right, welcome to the Lion's Den. For our new listeners, we break down the scoring system by category as we go, like always, but the full breakdown's available on our website. So today, this is our first requested episode. So today we have Chicago 17 to review. This is, I would say, familiar to both of us, right? I think I may have heard some of these B-sides for the first time in prepping for it, but otherwise, I was pretty familiar with most of the tracks.
I've never listened through this album.
Oh, okay. So blind to you? Or
Well, I mean, I've heard some of the music, but I've never listened to the album as a whole.
Gotcha.
So, in a way, the album is blind.
Okay, then same for me too, I guess. So, this is obviously a music album. It was released May 14th, 1984 by Full Moon / Warner Brothers. There's 10 tracks in the original pressing of the album, and then they did reissue it and included a bonus track at that time. The band members at release were Peter Cetera, lead and backing vocals, bass guitar, Bill Champlin, keyboards, guitar, lead and backing vocals, Robert Lamb, keyboards, lead and backing vocals, Lee Lufnane for trumpet. I'm sorry if I say any of your names wrong. James Pankow for trombone and horn arrangements, Walter Paraziter on the woodwinds, Chris Pinnock on guitars, and Danny Seraphine on the drums. So Cetera, Champlin, and Lamb did a lot of the lyric writing with producer David Foster and a few other collaboration writers, including Lionel Richie for this album. This album peaked at number 4 on the US Billboard 200 and number 4 on Canada's RPM, and also charted in multiple other international countries. It hit number 1 in Switzerland, of all places, which I thought was interesting. The album did achieve a certification of platinum 6 times, and it does remain the best-selling album in the band's history. In 1985, the year after it was released, it won 3 Grammys, the album. So, with that information, Holland, do you want to kick us off on the first category?
Sure. So our first category is lyrics / writing. So total possible score for this is 2 points, and I actually gave this 1.5 points out of 2. I almost gave this 1 out of 2, but I swayed myself into giving it more points. So overall, I think the lyrics of this album are pretty standard for the music of its time and pretty standard for good, like solidly written music. Nothing lyrically really was just over the top impressive for me, which is why I kind of leaned more towards the 1 out of 2. I do think, interestingly, this album lyrically gets better with each song. I feel like the first 2 tracks are really well written, but they're pretty conventional. There's nothing really revolutionary. They're pretty standard quality lyrics. And then track 3 and 4 get more dynamic. You have a good blend lyrically of pretty much all of the albums are love songs. And you have a good blend of like happy love songs and kind of sad love songs. You know, kind of these ballad type feel of the music, and the lyrics are reflected really well in that. I think that, interestingly, the track number 6, Along Comes a Woman, and then into track number 7, which is probably the most famous track from this album, kind of go together as a story. It's almost like Along Comes a Woman is the beginning, and then You're the Inspiration is kind of that, like, the relationship has kind of sealed the deal, and it's really significant after, you know, Along Comes a Woman, the lyrics of Along Comes a Woman. I think that kind of progressing into the last track of the original release album, which is Once in a Lifetime, I think it's a great end to the album as a whole. Lyrically, I think it's just a great, it's very well written, and it's kind of this, the culmination of this love song relationship driven lyrics. It kind of comes to a peak at the end. And so I like that. I think it's all pretty well written. I don't have anything real specific that stood out to me in this album, which is why I initially thought like I would just give it like 1 point out of 2. However, I do think that particularly the last song on the standard release album, Once in a Lifetime, and then track number 8, which I'm blanking out as to what.
Please Hold On.
Yeah, Please Hold On. I think those two have some really good lyrical descriptions. It's written really well. But the reason I gave it that extra half point instead of just 1 is because overall, the love songs in this album are really love songs that are not really written anymore. And by that I mean that they're kind of emphasizing and highlighting a more mature view of love that makes this music really timeless. So, for example, in You're the Inspiration, the concept of that song is it's a pretty popular song off this album, but the song is about, like a man's perspective of a woman being like, I need you. Like, I need you in my life. You're my inspiration. You're the inspiration. You're everything to me. Versus what a lot of love songs now are, I want you. Mm-hmm. Like, and whether that's sexual or not, most love songs now are...
It's much more shallow version.
Right. It's just, I want you... I like you.
Because you make me feel good.
Yeah, you make me feel good, or you're really attractive, or I just want to be with you. But the love songs on this album really are a more mature concept of like, you're everything to me. Like, you're the one person in my life that I need. And the way that like lyrically it's describing, the other person that the song's written to, it's very mature. It's a more mature love instead of this very like teenage kind of, puppy love-esque. And I think it's pretty significant to note that there's not a lot of songs being written like that anymore. And I think that it makes the lyrics multi-generational and it makes them kind of stand the test of time. So because of that, I gave it an extra half point because I felt like lyrically, the way that these songs are written and the way that they kind of describe love and the way that the view of another person when you're in love with that person is just very mature. It's very, adult instead of this kind of like, let's just, sleep around and enjoy ourselves. It's like, I want to have a lasting relationship with you. And I think that that's not really seen a lot in music today. So that's kind of all I really have. Nothing really specific. I think the songs are written really catchy. The rhyming scheme, all of things like that. Like the nuances of the songs are just they're very well written, but there's not anything, that really hit me, that this was just like the most beautifully written song I've ever heard. But I do think in the way that it's describing love is just very beautiful and very well done. So 1.5 points out of 2 for me.
Okay. For me, I had very similar thoughts, so I gave it 1 out of 2 points, and a lot of your sentiments I echo. There's nothing bad about this album by any means. However, there's not a lot of, like, really significantly, like, jaw-dropping or, like, like, moments where I was like, oh, wow, like, that's the lyrical moment. I do have some notes that are some specific notes just of things as I was listening. I think Only You has a really good lyrical rhythm that makes it feel more fun comparatively to the like 3 songs before it, which I thought were kind of to be honest. It's funny because this album has 4 title tracks, at least according to Wikipedia, which is Stay the Night, Hard Habit to Break, both songs which I'm kind of meh about, and then Along Comes a Woman and You're the Inspiration, which I think and I'll talk about this later, but I think that the first half of the album is a little more bland than the second half of the album.
Well, I think those 4 songs were I believe those were the songs that were released as singles.
Maybe that's what it was.
On this album.
Gotcha. But like, it's weird to me that I didn't really feel that there were anything significant to grab in the first 3 tracks. And I don't mean that as a huge negative or anything like that, because again, they weren't bad songs. But the first time I was kind of like, okay, I feel like we're actually getting something more interesting now. It wasn't until track 4, which is Only You. Remember the Feeling is kind of the love song that I felt like would be my example of like that really mature sort of love. That I agree with your comment about that. Remember the Feeling feels like a really personal track. Like that one was written by Cetera and Champlin together, and it definitely feels like it's coming from like a place of like personal experience. It just kind of feels more like almost like a diary entry in a way, and I think it's kind of effective in delivering the song. Musically, it's not one of my favorites, but there is kind of a perspective of like this like kind of, you know, as we get older and we look back and we reminisce at like memories and stuff, it kind of just seemed like an interesting way in this, you know, love song to kind of be like, do you remember like the first time that we did this? And, you know, it's like you look back and you realize like all of the time you've invested into somebody, and just kind of wanting to get back like the feelings that may not necessarily flare up in the way that they used to in the beginning stages of a relationship, but they're still really important to like remember and like look back on. So I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective for a song, and I really liked that. I think Along Comes a Woman is probably the most fun song lyrically. And that kind of reflects a lot, and kind of like there's a lot of like bounce to the words that I like. Please Hold On is probably the catchiest song on the album, and that was the one that was co-written by Lionel Richie, and I think it sounds like a Lionel Richie song, so it makes sense. The style feels pretty consistent throughout the whole song lyrically, throughout the whole album lyrically. I've noticed though that there's a lot of samey, and a lot of that comes in like the pattern of each song. It's pretty much all the typical verse, chorus, bridge, possibly an instrumental, and then like chorus, fade out. And we don't get basically any deviation from that pattern. And that's not a bad thing, because there's a reason that song pattern is the most popular, and it works, but it didn't feel like they really tried anything like super out of the boxy in regards to like how a song was structured or written in that regard. So for me, 1 out of 2 points for lyrics and writing.
Okay. So our next category is singing and vocal ability. I gave this 2 out of 2 points for singing and vocal ability. I know that, you know, Peter Cetera was not part of the original Chicago band, and he left after this album. This was his last album made with Chicago. But I don't think anyone can deny that he has an extremely iconic voice, and that he's very vocally talented. One thing I think is really unique to this album and Chicago, especially now, more so than ever, but even just in general music eras, especially from the 80s onward, I feel like, and this is just my perspective, so, you know, don't come after me for saying this, but there's very few bands that have more than one lead vocal. Most bands have a frontman, and then the rest of the band members just play instruments, and maybe they'll sing backups, maybe they won't. But for example, in bands that we've reviewed prior, like Paramore and or even like Taylor Swift,
yeah,
you know, there's one lead singer and then the band. And one thing I think that's really unique about Chicago is they're very much like the style of a rock band, and yet they don't have just one frontman. they have really three lead vocalists, and they do a really good job of rotating who's singing lead, and then whoever is singing backup, part of those backup vocals are sung by people that have previously sung lead. And I think that's just is noteworthy. You know, the fact that all three of them sing lead and all three of them sing well, and they sing in a style that's cohesive to the band as a whole, and yet they still sound very distinct in and of themselves. So Peter Cetera, Robert Lamb, and Bill Champlin are the three, you know, lead vocalists. And I think that it's, you know, personally, I know Peter Cetera is really the lead singer for Chicago on this album, but personally, I think that Robert Lamb and Bill Champlin have great vocals. I actually like Bill Champlin's voice better than Peter Cetera and Robert Lamb. I wish he was featured more, but specifically in track 3 and track 8, in particular, though his voice has a lot of soul to it, and I think he has a more soulful sound, even a more distinct sound to his voice because of that. The harmonies also, I think, are really done well in this album. I think that Chicago's strength as a group as a whole has always been just the harmonies that they integrate into their music. So, and of course in You're the Inspiration, which is probably, like I said, you know, the most popular song off this album, you know, the harmonies are just phenomenal, and the way that the background vocals will sing independent of the lead vocals and things like that are just done really well. I don't have a lot of negatives to say, other than the fact that I do think that Bill Champlin's voice, I wish his voice was featured more than Peter Cetera, although I know Peter Cetera was extremely popular and he's definitely talented. But I didn't take points off for that because I feel like that's more of a personal preference than a negative against the album or the band as a whole. So I give it 2 out of 2. I really don't have anything negative to say. I particularly, you know, don't have anything super noteworthy to say because I think overall the vocals on this album are just really consistent. So they're all pretty consistent with each other. So any other like negatives I would say I think would more contribute it to my personal taste rather than the quality. So 2 out of 2 for me.
Okay. For me, I also gave it 2 out of 2 points for singing and vocal ability. I do think that Chicago kind of shines in the harmonies, and it does. I think it is that way because you do have 3 leads, and so it doesn't really matter who is leading the song. You're gonna have, you know, other vocalists that are just as strong, able to kind of build these harmonies. Now, I did notice that the harmonies are typically like the standard like 3rd, 5th builds, which is not bad. It's like the typical way to build a harmony, but I always get really excited when a band that is vocally strong deviates from that, and I didn't really hear any deviations, which it's fine. It's just kind of like a note that I had. I didn't take off any points or anything like that. For Peter Cetera, yes, he has a really good range, but I do think he's featured a little bit too much. And again, this is probably personal preference, but like I thought that Champlin and Lamb had such unique colors to their tones that I wish that the leads had been almost more equally divvied up instead of giving Cetera like 2/3 of the album, which is basically how that shook down. I do think that there's a level of emotion that's built into the songs, particularly the ballads, that I think really adds to sort of like the feeling of a song. Because like obviously we know and acknowledge that music is emotional, but I think when you have a singer who is delivering a good emotional quality without compromising the tone of the vocals is like a nice additional layer. There are other singers that do this well, and there are other singers that don't do this well. You know, I think that like Taylor Swift is another good one that like we've reviewed in the past, where like she does a very good job at like layering emotion in without compromising the integrity of the actual notes. And I think Chicago does that really well they do that well, and adds to sort of the believability, I guess, of each track. I do think I didn't take any points off for this, but really the only negative that I have to say is that some of the choices of where they do like echoey or repeated lines seems a little bit out of place. Maybe this is more of a production note than a vocal note, because it's not like they're done poorly, but it almost feels odd, like, and I know it's indicative to the time too, especially like in slower songs, to have sort of like like your background vocals are kind of like repeating or echoing, or they're doing like an ooh or something. And for some reason, I didn't like some of the ones that came through on this album. I wish I had written down the specific tracks that it happened on, but I did not, so I cannot remember. I do think the most interesting vocals, like the most unlike the rest, is in track 8, Please Hold On, which Champlin leads. And I think that he does something completely different vocally than the rest of the album sees. And it's a little bit more like R&B and like, something like that. And I like that. It was refreshing to hear something slightly different than what we've been hearing. Not to say that any of it was bad. Like I said, Chicago's consistently good in vocals. But it's nice when you have a good vocalist give you something that you're not really expecting, because I think it just kind of emphasizes the fact that singer is talented and can be tasked with other types of genres of singing. So I really liked that one. As far as vocals go, I think it was the best one. But again, I don't have a ton of notes. It's just kind of consistently good. So 2 out of 2 points for singing and vocals. Okay, so next category is production. A total possible score of 2, and I gave this full points, 2 out of 2 points for production. Chicago's a phenomenal band. They've been around a long time, and this album has just really good production quality. I do want to make the caveat, or the anecdote, if you will, that I don't think the production of this album sounds like Chicago's older sound. Like the sound that they had prior to David Foster coming in and producing their album, which he did produce this one, sounded very different from... It's almost like David Foster, and I think that maybe kind of like you were mentioning, the way that the songs lyrically kind of followed the same structure, the way that, it's very smoothed out. The production of this album is very smoothed out compared to the really like more raw sounding of their older albums. And, whether you like that or don't is personal taste. So I couldn't really fault the album's production value because it doesn't sound consistent or similar to their prior, the way that their music sounded before Peter Cetera joined the band is very different. So I couldn't take any points off for it not sounding similar. I really tried to just look at this production value of this album independently, and I just think it's just done really well. Chicago, one thing that's very unique about Chicago compared to other bands is their use of horns and brass that really round out the sound. This album doesn't really feature a lot of brass that's only used for, a saxophone solo at one point in the bridge or, things like that, where we hear a lot of brass used in music as kind of like a highlight instrument that has like a solo, like how you'd have a guitar solo. I also think that production-wise, this album really highlights all of the vocalists and a lot of the different instruments that are playing. It's not just a produced album that only highlights the lead singer and the guitar solo that's halfway through. So overall, you can hear as you're listening to the album, you can pick out and listen to a wide variety of instruments, which is really hard to do when you have as many instruments as that appear on this album. I think that the ballads that are more key heavy just keep the songs from feeling whiny. That's one thing that is like a pet peeve of mine, is when you have a slow, soft ballad that may be like a breakup song
Like the song Remember the Feeling, that could easily have been just a really whiny, depressing sounding song, but the way it's produced and the way the instruments and the lyrics are handled, just overall put together, it doesn't sound like this like sappy whiny song that just annoys you. The instrumental breaks too can kind of come to highlight that horn section, the brass section, things like that, and I just think it's done really, really well. The instrumental break, particularly in track 6, Along Comes a Woman, I think it's just done really well. It really highlights that brass section and just the instrumental, the talent of your band members that, aren't necessarily singing. So, and then of course, I also want to kind of highlight, this album was produced in the era where every instrument you hear was live in a studio. It wasn't, they don't use sample tracks. They don't have, auto tune. It's all live and in person, being recorded on a microphone and put onto the album. And that's just something that's hard to do these days. We have a lot of samples and digital aspects of it. So I also really appreciate the fact that every instrument you're hearing was played live in the studio.
Right.
And a lot of the instruments are played by members of the band Chicago. Like, it's not like they hired studio musicians to play these horn instruments. They're actually band members of Chicago playing that music. And so that, in addition, really factors into the production aspect of it. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that as well. Again, nothing really like negative. I think the drum introducing the album in Stay the Night is really good. So it highlights multiple aspects of the instruments, things like that. So 2 out of 2 for production for me. And then also in general, David Foster's been in the industry for a really long time. And so it makes sense but it sounds like his style of production, which, either you love it or you hate it. I guess I think that this album was kind of for Chicago fans, wasn't really, some of the older Chicago fans weren't really happy with this album. And some people, of course, this album was very successful and did win a lot of accolades for the production. So, I know it's kind of a sticky topic, talking about the production of the album, but I think that, you got to give credit where credit's due. So 2 out of 2 points for me.
Okay, cool. So for me, out of 2 points for production, I gave it 1.5 points. I really only have like a couple tiny critiques, and I'll talk about those later, but I want to talk about the positives first. I do want to talk about the brass, because when do you ever find brass sections in rock music nowadays? You don't. And it's so cool to like layer that in. Especially in Along Comes a Woman. I mean, you mentioned that, but like that whole brass section is my favorite part of that song. It's just so nice and like fun, and like just everything about it. It feels fresh as far as like rock music goes. And I know that, this was 1984 and the sound of rock changes because all sounds of all genres shift as the years go by. But I think even in 1984, like, what other rock bands in 1984 had brass sections? I don't know of any off the top of my head. So it's like, I still feel like it's something that could be said as like being really, really creative. And I like that it is the way it is. There is, the sound is indicative to the era, but I really don't think that's a bad thing. Hang on, I'm going to look again because I don't remember. So Danny Seraphine, who was on the drums, I need to give him props because I think maybe this is a hot take, but re-listening to The Inspiration, which is the song I know the best off of this album anyway, but listening to it for the sake of this podcast episode made me realize I think the reason that song is such an anthem-y feeling ballad and not a sad-ish feeling ballad, which the lyrics are not sad, but I feel like songs like that have a tendency to sound melancholic, but Seraphine on the drums made that song feel so anthemy and like uplifting. That percussion through the whole thing drives that song. And I genuinely think that if the drums had not been so consistently good on that song, it wouldn't have been as popular as it is. I don't know. Is that too...
No, I think you're right. I think that's a good take, actually.
It turns that song from like what could have been feeling very like sappy to something feeling like this is it's almost like, okay, so we have the lyrics, you're the inspiration, and so it's almost like that level of like motivation and passion is reflected in the drive and the beat and rhythm of that song, which maybe sounds psycho to any of you that may not have heard that song, so go listen to it if you haven't, because maybe you'll understand what I'm saying. The bass also really great. However, this is going to be my segue into the one like critiques that I have for this. And it is the sound mixing is not super consistent instrumentally from track to track. There are some tracks I don't hear the drums hardly at all. There are some tracks where I feel like the synth overtakes the vocals a little bit. And I listened to it on Spotify, and so I don't know if it's maybe just the uploads that are there, but there were certain tracks where I felt like certain things were drowning out other things, and I wish that it was all a little bit more consistent in the mix. My other note, and I haven't decided if this is a critique or not, but I started counting from the very beginning. How many of these songs fade out, and how many of them just end? Every single one of them fade out. We have a fade out on every single one. So it makes me think, like, how do they end it? Like, live? If there's no actual end to the song.
Maybe they just segue into the next
Maybe. But I think the fade out concept is not, I feel like music has kind of shifted away from that over the last maybe 10 or 15 years. So I found it interesting because I expected fade outs to happen because it was the 80s, but I didn't expect it to be every single track. And so I literally started like tally marks on my sheet, and then I was just like, actually, it's just all of them.
Yeah. I noticed that too, that there was a significant amount of fade outs on this album, and I didn't really touch on it because I feel like I don't know. I thought that maybe I'm the only one that doesn't really like fade outs on albums, but so I didn't even really address it because I'm like, maybe I'm just the only one, but I don't know. I guess
I don't love them, to be honest. I actually prefer a clean ending for a song. However, I can accept a fade if I feel like it appropriately fits like the vibe of the song or the musicality of the song, then I'll take it. But generally I prefer a clean end to a song. Again, that might be personal preference, which is why I don't know if it's really a critique or not. Yeah. But all of that to say, 1.5 points out of 2 for me for production.
Alrighty. So the next category is album flow / cohesion. Out of 1 point, I give this full points. I actually was reading, one thing we kind of can mention on this category is the cover art. And I think that I was reading in prepping for this podcast, the cover art for this album is apparently acclaimed as like one of the greatest album covers of the era of when this album was released. It's been considered pretty noteworthy as far as the way that the album cover was designed. I think it's pretty consistent with Chicago's albums that are typically released, but I just thought that was interesting. In general, the flow of the album, I actually like the flow of the album. I like that it kind of builds as you go, that the songs get a little more, I guess, like lyrically complex as you go, that the way that the songs are structured back to back to back, that they kind of tell a story and flow into each other really well. I think it breaks up the higher energy songs with the ballads really well. You don't feel like you've dragged for too long, and you also don't feel like you've been worn out. The length of the album, if you're considering, oh crap, I don't know if this factors in the bonus track or not. I think the album without the Here's Where We Begin is technically a bonus track that's on a lot of digital versions, but it was not part of the original album. Without that track, the album length, I believe, is 41 minutes and 53 seconds.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good length for an album. The song lengths are really good. They all average between like 3 and 4 minutes for each song. Feels really consistent. The way that the songs are written, as far as and how they flow together, the love songs flow really well from one to the next. The one that seemed a little out of place to me, I think they get away with having We Can Stop the Hurting included in this. I feel like having it at the beginning is a good way to kind of get away with having a very different message list in there. I mean, it's very more like socially driven, looking at the world around us and wanting to stop the hurt in the world versus a relationship-esque love song. So I think they do really well by putting that towards the beginning. I think I'll give them a pass on that. One that I wouldn't take off points for it, but it does kind of feel out of place is Prima Donna. I think it just kind of feels like you're singing about a love song, and granted it's a song about a woman, but I was just kind of like, this is kind of an odd song message wise, like lyrically, to just kind of throw in the middle of this album that's very much geared towards love and romance and a relationship. But I don't think that's negative. I think that's more of just my take on it.
Okay.
So that's why I didn't take any points off for that, because I do think it still fits very well. One thing I really wanted to note is I thought it was an amazing decision, symmetry wise, I guess would be the best way to put it. But the track opens with these heavy drums the album opens with Stay the Night. These drums really open the album for you. And then if you think about it, the way this album, with vinyls, you flip the album over to listen to the second side, and the Along Comes a Woman opens that album to you again with really a drum heavy song. And so I thought it was great that both sides of the album there's cohesion even from switching from one side to another. So there's symmetry in the way that Stay the Night opens and the way that Along Comes a Woman opens the second side. And I thought that was just done really well. And if you're just listening to it on Spotify or just listening through the album on a playlist, you wouldn't really get that.
Yeah.
But in thinking through, like, okay, this would be the second side of an album, there would be a pause between you flipping the album over and listening to that side. I just thought it was a great choice to make that artistically, that you're kind of having the same introduction to each side of the album, and yet it stays really consistent, even if you're just listening through it straight through on a digital platform. And then I think Once in a Lifetime is a great ending to the album. It's, lyrically, musically, it's kind of this culmination, like I kind of mentioned earlier when we're talking about lyrics. I think it's a great, peak at the end. You've kind of been climbing up this mountain the whole way, and now you've reached the peak with Once in a Lifetime. I think that's a great ending to the album. So overall, I maybe don't really get why, Prima Donna, I don't think it fits perfectly. Maybe lyrically and conceptually, but I do think, lyrically, musically, it fits. So I gave it full points, 1 out of 1.
Okay. For me, for album flow and cohesion, I gave it half a point out of 1. I think it's definitely consistent, but personally, I feel like the first half of the album, it just feels so flat to me, and I don't know what it is. Maybe this is more of a personal thing, but the first 3 songs seem to bounce so strangely from upbeat to we kind of dip down and then we go back up, and something about it just made the first half of the album feel kind of bleh to me. I think it would have been more interesting if they had more consistently built up to a mood instead of trying to do this back and forth bounce. I think the second half of the album just flows so much better. I disagree with your point about Prima Donna. I think that lyrically, yes, I think lyrically, yes, it is, maybe doesn't consistently fit, but I think musically it flows so nicely at the end of the album, toward the end of the album, I should say, that I really like where it's placed. I don't know if it's just, I wish that maybe it's just I just don't like the songs from the first half of the album as much. But I just felt like the flow felt very almost stagnant. It almost like wasn't a flow. It just kind of felt like we were just like willy-nilly bouncing back and forth from like upbeat to more ballady. And it just didn't feel very purposeful to me at all. So for me, I didn't love the flow of the first half, but I do think that ending kind of on like a high strong note is much better than ending on like a more melancholy note. I've noticed that a lot of albums tend to end the album on kind of like a sad note, and I don't know why that is, but I liked ending the album kind of on sort of like a high strong, sort of like encouraging kind of feeling, instead of like now we're super sad because the album is over, which, I'm not a huge fan of. So for me, I gave it 0.5 point out of 1 for album flow.
Okay, so next to last category, as always, is personal taste and preference. And we're only allowed 2 points for this, and I only give this 0.5 point out of 2. I do like Chicago. I grew up listening to their music with my dad, but this particular album isn't one that really jumps out at me. There's other albums or songs that I enjoy more, and if I was making a playlist, I would probably only pick like maybe 1 or 2 songs off this album. So that's why I gave it 0.5 point. I think that this album, you can't deny that this album was successful. I don't think you can really discredit the quality of this album, but I just personally don't really enjoy it. I grew up listening to a lot more of Chicago's older music, their previous music, that really had maybe, I guess, a harder sound to it, more dynamic sound to it. It really featured the brass a lot more. It felt more, it felt less cleaned up and like overproduced. And I feel like this album just feels really like everything feels like it's kind of dampened when you compare it to their earlier stuff. So I really thought about like adjusting points in the prior categories, but I really didn't think that would be fair to the album itself. It's just really not for me. So I know my dad is probably going to listen to this podcast episode, and he's a huge Chicago fan. It's probably his favorite band ever. So sorry, Dad, I only gave this 0.5 point out of 2. But I hope I still love you.
This is indicative of my affection for my father.
I've just been written out of the will. So
so for me, for personal taste and preference out of 2 points, I gave it 1 point. For kind of the same reasons, Chicago reminds me of my parents. And when I listen to Chicago, it's usually because I'm with them. And while, that means that there is some affectionate feelings attached to Chicago when I listen to their music, it's not something that I put on when I'm in the car by myself, commuting. I'm much more likely to put on some pop punk or even Broadway before I am going to put on Chicago. And again, it's not a slight toward the band. It's just not my go-to. I think like, especially songs like You're the Inspiration really, really remind me of my parents because, there's stories attached to these songs that they've told me about. I do think that, there, are some really great moments in the album. And I have to say, I did enjoy it while listening to it. It wasn't like it's not like preparing for this episode felt like a chore or anything like that. It's just not typically what I'm gonna just put on because I'm in the mood for Chicago. I'm never in a Chicago mood. I might culminate a playlist that would have a Chicago song in it or something, from this album. But I'm not going to sit down and listen to Chicago 17 because that's what I want to listen to. So yeah, just 1 out of 2 points for me for personal taste.
Alrighty. And last category is creativity. I think, for the reason that we talked about before, the way that Chicago really is unique in the sense that it's a rock band with a really prominent brass section. I think Chicago as a band overall, I would give them 1 out of 1 point for creativity. However, we're reviewing this album specifically and not the band as a whole, their whole discography. So I give this 0.5 point out of 1 for creativity. Mostly because I think You're the Inspiration has become such an iconic track, and this album is their most successful album. I think that, I'm sure for a lot of people, Chicago's been around since the early 70s, and here it is 1984, so almost, 14, 15 years later. This was probably a lot of people's first introduction to Chicago because you kind of crossed another generational line there. But I think even still today, You're the Inspiration is still a hugely successful song for them. And kind of like I mentioned towards the beginning of this podcast, lyrically, I think these songs, the way that a lot of these love songs are written, are just iconic. Like, they've stand the test of time because there's still just that timeless concept of I'm in love with somebody and they're everything to me. And I think that as a more like mature view of love and mature view of romance versus just like, I want a, pretty girl that will make me feel happy. It's just something that's very timeless. And so this album, I think, is still very much an iconic piece of music history, if I can be so bold as to say that. But I don't think that it's, a standout from, other albums that Chicago's written per se. I think that there are other songs that Chicago's written and other albums that they've written that are just as successful and prominent as this album. So I don't think it's like the one album of greatness that they've ever written. And I also don't think that as a stamp on music history, it's the best album ever. I think there's other impacts that Chicago's had on music. So I didn't think it merited full points, because I think that there's other songs, other albums that have had just as much impact on music and have been as unique and iconic as this album and songs that are from this album. But I do think it merits some credit. So that's why I gave it 0.5 point out of 1.
Okay. And for me, for creativity, I gave it the full point, and that really all comes down to the iconic nature of not just this album, but Chicago as a whole. And I feel like they should be recognized. I kind of feel like they sort of paved the way in their era for like that type of music, sort of that like American rock sound. And while their sound changed over the years, I think it's kind of like it was a reflection of the natural progression of like just music at the time. And I think that they did a lot. They've kind of made a name for themselves deservedly over their long careers. And so while I kind of agree with your sentiments that like I don't think this album is the end all be all for them, I do recognize that it is the album that I feel like is probably the gateway for a lot of people into Chicago's music, and I think that should be recognized because it is a very accessible album, and with 4 singles that came out of it, I feel like you kind of have, no matter what your taste preferences, you're probably going to enjoy at least one of those 4 singles. So, and then I think, once you get into a band's singles, it's like kind of like your stepping stone into their B-sides. And so, if you can get snagged by 1 or 2 of the singles from this album, then you're more likely to dive in and listen to the whole thing, and get the B-sides as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's not like they did anything crazy or out of the box or unpredictable, or anything like that, but they just are iconic and successful, and because of that, I decided to give it the full point for creativity.
Alrighty.
So
Another note I had with creativity that I didn't factor into the scoring, but I know that they do have on a lot of the digital releases the song "Here Is Where We Begin" as a bonus track. And this is kind of my personal take on it. I'm glad it's a bonus track because I think it's a horrible end to the album.
Yeah, I don't like it.
I don't like it at all.
I pretended it didn't exist.
Yeah. So I know that for a lot of people, if you're listening, the way most people listen to your music now is all digital, and that track may be listed as the end of your digital version of this album. But I really didn't like it. I actually didn't even really listen to the whole thing because I didn't really like it.
I listened to the whole thing, but regretted it.
Yeah. So my total score for Chicago 17 is 7.5 out of 10.
And mine is 7 out of 10.
All right.
So pretty close. Anything else you want to talk about, or you want to go into lightning round?
No, we can go into lightning round.
Okay. Lightning round number 1. Question 1. Favorite track?
I think it's either Along Comes a Woman or Once in a Lifetime, but probably Along Comes a Woman.
Okay. Mine is actually Prima Donna, and it's because the bass with the synth percussion is so good to me. It's so good. Just musically, it's like my favorite track. So Prima Donna would be my favorite.
Yeah. I also really like Hard Habit to Break. I like that song a lot too.
I think my second one would probably be Please Hold On. I thought it was really good.
That was a good one too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Least favorite track? Other than Here Is Where We Begin.
Yeah, if I can't pick that one would absolutely be the one I would pick. I don't really have like a least favorite track, but one that I didn't really like Remember the Feeling. I just thought it was kind of meh.
Okay.
But I'm not really a big fan of like slow songs or ballads. It's just not usually where I gravitate. So
mine would probably be We Can Stop the Hurtin'. I was kind of meh about it.
Yeah, I didn't really like that one that much either.
I didn't skip it or feel like I needed to skip it or nothing.
Right.
It was just kind of boring to me.
Yeah.
Sorry, any fans of that song. Okay. What lyrical or musical change would you make to the album?
To the album as a whole, I would honestly, and I know for people that aren't, super familiar with Chicago like as a whole, but I would highlight the brass more. I feel like they were really toned down, especially like I mentioned, I like Chicago's older stuff, and that brass is really, really forward, and they have a lot of, they're highlighted really well. And I really don't like that they were kind of put in the back, like the back of an orchestra. They sound like studio musicians instead of band members.
Right.
So I would fix that.
Yeah. I would tamper down the synth a bit. It's not that I think the synth is bad, but it overpowers so much of this album that I just wish that they would kind of tamper that back just a smidge. That's probably the biggest musical change I would make. Okay, 4. What track would you delete from the album?
If I had to delete it, probably We Can Stop the Hurtin'.
Same.
Yeah.
Like, just, okay, bye.
Yeah.
I felt like it didn't add, and it all it added to was my critique of how the first half of the album is.
Yeah.
Did you watch any of the music videos?
I did not. I didn't even think about watching music videos.
You know me. I always watch the music videos.
Yeah. So how were they?
They were okay. Along Comes a Woman was definitely the funnest one. Stay the Night was so weird. I'm gonna recap the Stay the Night music video for you, okay?
Do it.
So it starts out with Cetera, and he's like a mechanic or something for a garage, like a car garage, and this girl has like dropped off her like super awesome like convertible or whatever. I don't know what car it is, but she's like the stereotypical like bad girl persona. She's wearing like a pencil skirt and like a leather jacket, and her hair's all teased and like stuff like that. And he like obviously like wants to get with her, so she pulls away in her car and he tries to jump in it, which is weird. And he hangs onto the side of her convertible as she's driving while he's singing to her. And she, like, shakes him off and he rolls onto the ground. And then he, like, jumps into the back of a truck that has Lamb and what's his name? Champlin in it. And they're, like, driving. They're, like, chasing this woman down. And then the police get involved and there's, like, just this huge chase. And I'm like, just let the lady drive away in her convertible. So that's the Stay the Night music video.
Oh.
That's literally, like, the summary. Anyway, that doesn't have anything to do with the lightning round other than I was going to ask if you had a favorite music video.
Well,
but you didn't
that
watch
one, obviously.
And
but
then,
not the music video, just your recap of it.
Okay. And then there was also a music video for Hard Habit to Break and You're the Inspiration, which are kind of just like the band just kind of like standing there like playing and singing. It's like nothing super. Actually, I take that back. I'm pretty sure in You're the Inspiration they have like montage scenes of like a bunch of like couples. And I just remember there was one like younger punk couple. Like there's like a lot of like metal like accessories and like leather, and they're just like making out in an alley, and I'm like, I don't want to see that, but thanks. I do remember that's part of the video.
Great. Sounds great.
It was weird. Anyway, so my favorite music video for the question is probably Along Comes a Woman.
Stay the Night?
No.
Although
that one is pretty wild, I will admit.
It was the 80s.
Okay, last question. If you could have another artist cover a song from this album, what artist and song would you pick?
Ooh.
I want Lionel Richie to sing the song that he helped write, which is Please Hold On. Because I think he would sound great. It sounds like a Lionel Richie song, obviously, because he helped write it. So I want to hear his voice on it. I think that would be neat.
That would be cool.
I would dig that.
I mean, I feel like... I don't know. That's a tough question. Because I could think of like a couple different options.
Okay.
You know?
Well,
I would want to hear... it would be so wild. But I would want to hear somebody like Imagine Dragons do You're the Inspiration.
Oh.
Like do kind of like a more modern like rock band, like the way that rock is, rock's kind of changed. I don't know if you would call Imagine Dragons rock.
I would.
Or if you call them like pop rock or whatever. But something like that.
Indie rock.
Yeah, I don't know if they're really indie anymore. Like if they've gone mainstream. I don't know. I'm not a big fan. Like I don't listen to their music a lot, but it's not like I'm, if you're a hardcore Imagine Dragons fan, you can, send us a message and correct us. But, yeah, like somebody like that, like somebody that's kind of doing like more modern rock style, or pop rock style, and go back and do kind of that classic like sounding song. I also thought when I was listening through this album that it would be, there are parts of this album that just sort of that classic 80s sound that reminded me of the song that Kristoff sings in Frozen 2 with the reindeer.
Lost in the woods.
With Kristoff, like the reindeer, like the backing vocals and stuff. And I was like, so maybe they could cover a song.
That'd be funny.
I don't know.
I just thought about like One Republic doing like Stay the Night.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
That would be funny.
But I feel like You're the Inspiration because it's so iconic. It would be so hard for somebody to do it without it just being a straight cover. Or like how Weezer did the cover of Africa by Toto.
Yeah.
Like, if somebody like that, they did, Along Comes a Woman. Or something like that.
Yeah, that would be cool.
So, that's kind of a generic answer.
That's okay.
But, yeah.
Anything else? Any other thoughts?
No. Sorry, Dad.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us in this episode. We look forward to having you back. Don't forget about our social medias. Twitter is at Lion and Mouse Pod, and Instagram is at Lion and Mouse Podcast. Website, lionandmousepodcast.com. Notes, rules of engagement, all sorts of cool things. Suggestion box. Tell us what you'd like us to review. Since this episode was a request, your request could be next. So make sure you tell us what you want us to talk about. You can also support us on Patreon. Don't forget we have that. Gifts, exclusive content. And if you like what you heard, please give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. The feedback helps us to make things better. Thank you so much for listening. As always, we will catch you in the next one.